Hi, it's Miss Marsden and I'm going to take you through a lesson on nutrient cycling today. So what you need is the booklet. So if you are in top set, you need the higher booklet. And if you are in either set 2 or 3, you need the foundation booklet. So the do now task in both of them is the same. It's your fluency test as usual. So I've put some hints on the board that you need. So independent variable, as always, is what you're changing. Be really specific. Don't say amount, say volume or mass, for example. Dependent variable is what you measure. Control variable is what you keep the same. And then you've got your definitions of range and intervals there as well. People do seem to be getting a lot better at those, which is fantastic. A lot of people seem to be leaving out the table when they're sending the work back to me, but you can do it like I've done below if you're working on the computer. If you're not working on a computer and you're sending me a photo, you can just draw the table with a pencil and ruler, but use the example and apply it to the specific hypotheses which you've been given for the fluency test. Don't forget to fill in your risk assessment as well. So the risk is what could happen, so what's posing the risk, and then the precaution that you'd take is, for example, putting goggles on. So if your risk was getting irritant acid on your skin, then a safety precaution could be, for example, washing your hands afterwards. So pause the video for as long as you need to complete it. I'd recommend about 10 minutes on that. And remember to mark it using the answer booklet and to give yourself a mark out of 15 to see if you're improving throughout the weeks. So what I want us to be able to do by the end of this lesson is to be able to describe the water cycle and to explain why it's so important. I want us to be able to identify the processes in both the water cycle and the carbon cycle. And I want us to be able to describe each process which is involved. So do now questions, which you can either do on a piece of paper, a Word document, or you can add them to your booklet. So you've got 5 questions. Some of them are linking back to what you covered last year. So your paper 1 content. If you do need to look anything up, please do. But give him your best shot. I'd recommend taking about 5 minutes on this because there's 5 questions. And we're going to go through them on the next slide. So this one is active transport because we're talking about mineral ions. If you were talking about water, for example, it'd be osmosis. But in terms of mineral ions, you're always going from a low to a high concentration, so it has to be active transport. If you didn't get that, make sure you write down the full definition for active transport there. Number 2 is very straightforward. It's osmosis because it's water. The 2 products of photosynthesis, so don't forget that products means what comes out of it. So if you didn't know that, again, highlight the keyword products and write a definition that is what comes out of a reaction. It's what's made. So 3 things a plant can do with the glucose that's been made in photosynthesis. So storage, respiration, and you can also talk about making new molecules such as fats, proteins, and also storage in the roots as well. Fruits are an example of storage in plants. If you got that, that's fine too. And then which vessel transports sugars around the plant? That's the phloem. If you put xylem, you need to make sure that you write a definition for both of them. So phloem is for sugars and xylem is for water. Let's give yourself a mark out of 5 there and make all the corrections you need to. So first thing we're going to cover is the water cycle, which is a little bit easier. So water is continuously cycled by, I've labelled them as 6 different processes here. Your first one is not necessarily in the same order I've put it in at the bottom. That's just so you can access the writing task later on. So you can start at any given point in a cycle. It doesn't necessarily matter which one. So evaporation from surface water, for example, oceans, lakes, streams, reservoirs, they're all examples of surface water. So evaporation of surface water, as well as transpiration in plants, turns liquid water into water vapour. So on my diagram, number 1, which is transpiration, and number 6, both turn liquid water into water vapour. All that transpiration is, you might want to write a specific definition of this down if you don't know this already. It's water evaporating from the stomata of plants. So they're the little holes on the underside of leaves, if you remember from last year. So a first step in the water cycle where we're starting from here is the liquid water turn into water vapour from either transpiration or from surface water. Once it's evaporated, it rises high up into the atmosphere, and that's where that water vapour then cools, because obviously it's cooler high up in the atmosphere, and that causes the particles to lose energy. And when they lose energy, they'll go from a gas to a liquid. So when we've got a liquid high up in the atmosphere, it's going to fall as either rain, snow, or hail. And a word you can use to encompass all those three things is precipitation, like on the diagram. So as you can see, that precipitation, it can then cause runoff, and that basically just means it goes into either groundwater, which is underwater, or it can start building up in lakes, streams, oceans, reservoirs. Then if you think about it, it can be taken up by plants through the roots. Animals can drink it. So you can see how it's constantly being cycled. So what I need you to be able to do on the next test, I'm not asking you to do this now, but basically the 1 to 6 that I've got in the box on the left, you need to provide a definition for each one. So somewhere making notes, it doesn't have to be neat, but I'd like you to provide a definition for each of the 6, which I've got in the yellow box at the side. So we'll do transpiration together, like on the booklet, and transpiration is basically the evaporation of water through the stomata of the plant. So that's my definition for transpiration. I'd like you to give a definition for each of the other 5. Use the link which I've given in this week's instructions on the Continuity of Learning website if you need to. Use BBC Bite Size. Use what you need to, just quick 6 definitions. Pause it for as long as you need to do that research. So, in your booklet, you've got a picture of the water cycle. Using your notes, I'd like you to now describe the processes involved in the cycling of the water. So, start off with evaporation and then work your way through the other ones. And please make sure that you use those key words. I've done the first one for you, so you've already used stomata, for example. So pause it for as long as you need to. Describe all of the processes involved in the cycling of water. So in one paragraph, using the notes you've just made, using all the keywords at the bottom, and remember to highlight all of those keywords that you've used. So, water evaporates from rivers, streams. You might have put oceans, reservoirs, any of that. And that enters the atmosphere. You can also have the water also evaporates through the stomata of plants, and we know that as transpiration. And then the water vapour rises High up in the atmosphere, it cools down. Higher level, you might want to be talking about how it cools down. So link it to paper 1 where you're talking about particles, talk about losing energy. So the water vapour cools down to form liquid water, and we call that precipitation. It falls to earth, and if it lands on hills, mountains, high up ground, it'll form runoff. So that's the water cycle. Again, just double check over all of that. But the water cycle is quite straightforward, and we need to understand that concept that the water's constantly being reused throughout the ecosystem. So we're going to apply that knowledge that we've got onto a different cycle, which is the carbon cycle. We've got to remember the reason that we have these cycles is because there's only a finite amount, so a limited amount of these atoms, these compounds, so they constantly have to be reused throughout the ecosystems. That's why we have cycles. So we're going to introduce a new concept, which is decay. Basically, when something dies, they're decayed, they're broken down. That's due to the action of microorganisms, so we're talking about bacteria, fungi. And what they do is they break down the material so it can be reused by plants, so it breaks it down into minerals like we've talked about. But while they're doing that, they're respiring, just like we do, and they produce carbon dioxide. So some of that carbon is being cycled because it's being taken up by plants as minerals, but some of it is going back to the environment straight away because the bacteria and the fungi are respiring and they're producing carbon dioxide. So we're going to focus on carbon because all living things contain carbon, and it's what we know as an organic material. The processes we need to know for this one, it's different obviously to the water cycle. We need to talk about it in terms of photosynthesis, respiration, feeding, decay and combustion. So I've got a diagram of the carbon cycle, and the carbon cycle is straightforward. You just, it's the same thing, you just need to pick a certain point to start off with, and then you just follow the arrows around. It's linking together all the ideas we've got so far, including what we've been talking about in the atmosphere topic. And you need to have a strong understanding of photosynthesis and respiration from paper 1 as well. So I'm going to start with talking about feeding. So an animal, for example this goat, feeds on a plant. So the carbon's passed along from the plant to the goat. So that goat, after it's eaten the plant, needs to respire. So what gas is given out in respiration? You need to remember that carbon dioxide is given out in respiration. So that carbon dioxide as a gas is then returning to the environment. That goat during its life cycle as well is also going to produce waste. It's going to produce feces, it's going to produce urine, and all of that contains carbon, so that returns it to the ground. It'll also die, and we've just talked about what happens when it dies, and when it produces waste, it's decayed. So I'm going to follow the respiration line. So when the goat respires, it returns carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and that carbon dioxide can then be taken in by photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is where carbon dioxide and water are used to produce glucose, which is full of carbon, and oxygen. So that glucose is then locked up in the plant, and we can then follow the arrow because it's eaten by the goat. Plants also respire So don't forget that plants are also returning carbon dioxide to the atmosphere because plants respire too, so they also give out carbon dioxide. So don't think about plants and animals as being completely separate. So trees can also die as well, and they can be decayed. But what can also happen is they can be locked up in fossil fuels. And we've been talking lots about fossil fuels in our lessons about the atmosphere. So what we can do is we can dig up those fossil fuels in millions of years' time, and we can burn them. And what happens when you burn them? So combustion means burning. Combustion, as we know, releases lots of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So that carbon dioxide can then be cycled and it can be taken back in photosynthesis. That carbon's taken in as glucose. The goat can eat it, or the tree can die and be decayed. The bacteria can release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, and it can also produce minerals which can be retaken up by the plant, or fossil fuels can be produced and then they can be combusted again. Can you see how you can choose a given point and it can just constantly go round and round? So the key points you need to know the definition of are photosynthesis, respiration, decay, and combustion. So 4 key points there that you need to be comfortable with. So to be successful in the questions asking you about the carbon cycle, you need to be able to do the following. You need to be able to name and describe the processes. So the 4 processes we just talked about: photosynthesis, respiration, decay, combustion. So if you use an example, we're talking about the carbon within the air, so gaseous carbon dioxide, being taken into plants. So you need to recognise that that's photosynthesis, and then you need to be able to describe the process. So carbon dioxide is taken in by the plant and converted to glucose. To make glucose is fine too. So name the process, what happens. So in the booklet, I'd like you to answer questions on the carbon cycle. If you're not confident with what I've just gone over in terms of the processes, in folder there's a help sheet, and there's also a link to a video which will go through it again. The answers to the help sheet are in folder as well, so you can make sure that it's all correct if you're still not understanding it or I went through it a little bit quickly. So pause the video for as long as you need to. I would recommend 5 minutes, but take as long as you need to understand it. So like we said, the processes, key points that you need for this are photosynthesis, respiration, decay, and feeding. You could also have combustion as well, but you basically just need to know that feeding is passing along of glucose along the food chain until they either die or they give out waste products. And that links you back to decay. Obviously they're respiring the full time, and photosynthesis has been the start of all food chains, so you can see how that idea is linked together. You can also talk about as well, you can link in together from the chemistry topic, that carbon dioxide can dissolve in the oceans and it can form limestone, for example. So you've got a long written task now, and what I'd like you to do is to be able to name and describe each process involved in the carbon cycle. So Carbon in the form of carbon dioxide, this is my example, is taken in from the air into plants by photosynthesis. That is when carbon dioxide is taken in, glucose is made. So I've done the photosynthesis one. I'd like you to do the following. So respiration, decay, feeding and combustion. So start it off the same. So if you're doing respiration, say carbon in the form of carbon dioxide is given out by plants and animals in respiration. Then you might want to give the word equation, okay? We're going to go through this and you can check your answers against mine and you can improve them. Use the example, just change the key words in it. So we've gone through the photosynthesis example. So carbohydrates, so glucose is taken into animals during feeding. They eat and digest it. You can also say it's used to help them grow. It's very complex, like higher level to say make new cells and tissues. If you're looking for a grade 9, go for that. But if you just say grow, grow is fine. So animals and plants release carbon dioxide as a waste product of respiration. You can just say they release it in respiration. Again, underlined content there is the highest level content. If you're aiming for a grade 8, grade 9, include that. When plants and animals die, their bodies are decayed. Microorganisms, you could go into more detail. You could say such as bacteria or fungi. Release carbon dioxide during respiration. So again, if you haven't got this level of detail, you can add it. And then you can talk about fossil fuels being burnt as well. So you could say carbon is locked up in fossil fuels. This carbon can be released as carbon dioxide through combustion. So 2 types of questions you can get. You'll always have a diagram of the carbon cycle, so you basically just need to recognise what are those processes and which ones are they asking me about. So in this diagram, if I'm just looking at process A, for example, you need to recognise what it is. So you've got carbon dioxide in the air and it's being taken in by the grass. So you think, what process uses carbon dioxide and incorporates carbon dioxide into carbohydrates in plants? So you must know that that is photosynthesis. The rest of the arrows, for example, if it asks you to recognise them, we can see that these ones are feeding. Oops, gone a bit farther. So the grass is eaten by the rabbit, so that's feeding. The rabbit is eaten by the fox. But obviously the fox, just like I've started to highlight, is not eaten by the carbon dioxide in the air. This line, I'm going to do in a different colour, must show respiration. So don't forget that the rabbit also respires. And so does grass, which is a plant. Don't forget that plants respire. So those ones are respiration. I'm going to do green for photosynthesis because we're talking about a plant. And that's how you do it. Just identify which arrows mean what, put it into words. So I've got feeding in yellow, respiration in red, and then photosynthesis is in green. Put it into words. Don't need to talk about anything else there because that's all it's asking you to do. You don't need to talk about combustion because it's not on there. What I'd like you to do is to complete the extension questions on this content. Then the answers are in the answer booklet. Please do check them. A lot of the work I'm getting back does have some really simple mistakes in there that you could have identified for yourself and you could have helped yourself improve, which is a better way of learning than just having me pointing it out for you. So please give them a go. And then please make sure you send me your booklets by the 8th of June